The Little Tailor of Yarpole. Back in the days when every village had a tailor, because there was no going to the shops to buy clothes for most people, there lived a little tailor at Yarpole. He made his living taking the clothes of the gentry when they had got tired of them or they were no longer fashionable, and altering them to fit the people of the village. This was not as hard as it sounds, because the villagers were smaller than most of the gentry, not having access to so much good meat. So a bit of chopping off at the arms of the jackets and the legs of the trousers would go a long way. Of course, there was more to it than that. Every woman for miles around the village of Yarpole was skilled with a needle, so the little tailor had to be particularly good at the finer mysteries of the trade, the tucks and snips that never made it into the instruction of gentlewomen or their servants. The little tailor was a painstaking fellow, noted for his fine small stitching, so that he was sometimes called upon to carry out some last-minute alterations to a ball gown, or putting the epaulettes on a recently promoted militia officer. He had become a tailor because he had been delicate as a child, not expected to live. His mother had known that the hard life as an agricultural labour, like that of his father, would be sure to send him to his grave. So, while the other boys of the village were out on the green playing their hard games, she sat him down next to her and taught him needlework. The fact was kept secret, even from his father. In those unenlightened days, the only man allowed to use a needle outside of a tailor's shop was a sailor. A sailor, with the lack of women on board a ship, was allowed a lot of leeway. But it all stood him in good stead when his mother took him to be apprenticed to the village tailor, and he could prove that he already knew enough to make the man money. While his former schoolmates were slogging it out in the fields, he was indoors learning a trade. While they were being roasted in the sun, he was in the cool of the shop, working with his needle. While they were being drenched in the wind and the rain, he was sitting by the fire working with his needle. And, after the long day's work, they were carousing in the pub, and he was still sitting by candlelight working with his needle. For a tailor must work long hours if he is to put bread on his table. It is also a lonely life, because not many women will look at a man who has a good working knowledge of another woman's undergarments. Eventually the old tailor and his old mother died, and he was left with a home and business for himself. He had been a dutiful son, and a hard-working apprentice, and had always done what his mother and his master asked of him. Now, with those good influences gone, he started to grow resentful of his life and all the things he thought that he had missed. Instead of spending all his evenings crouched over a candle losing his eyesight, he now took to spending the occasional evening down in the pub, where all the other men went. He found that when he entered the pub, the crowd sitting at the far table would shout, "Hurrah! It's the little tailor of Yarpole!" Whether it was from his good company, or because he was spending the little bit of money that his mother had left him, he didn't know, and he didn't much care. He had been a lonely fellow in the past, and now he was finding out how good it was to have friends. How long this would have gone on for, I cannot tell. But, one evening, and a good one it had been, he was making his way back home in the dark. Walking home would have put too strong a picture of it, because the method of locomotion involved a certain amount of staggering and a great deal of sitting on a wall, thinking about the next move. At the back of his mind, he knew that he had a lot of work to do the next day. In fact, he had a lot of work that he should have done this evening. The housekeeper was expecting the Crofts to return from Croft Castle any day now from London, and had asked him to repair some curtains that should already be hanging up at the windows. Knowing that he needed a good rest and an early start, he decided to take a short-cut through Yarpole churchyard. Now, a churchyard may be a perfectly good place for a short-cut in the daytime. It is not such a good place in the dark of night, when you have taken a drink. It took the tailor a couple of minutes to work out how to get through the lich gate, even though he had been through it 100 times before. He stumbled on determinedly along the path, but with increasing doubt in his mind. Even in the dark, the path shone out leading to the church, and, with a few false steps, he found he was able to follow it. Perhaps he was going to be all right. He had almost reached the church door. Then all he would have to do is turn along the side of the church and go out by the side gate. He was going sunways around the church, so he would be fine. Then a movement caught his eye. Something white was gliding towards him from the church wall, moving among the graves with an inhuman motion. He heard it snuffling, like a creature hunting. With a scream, he turned and ran. In his panic, he ran off the path where an open grave had been dug, ready for a funeral the next morning. He saw it long after he would have been able to stop himself, and he plunged down into it. An open grave is 6 foot of air, and then hard earth at the bottom. He knocked his head on the hard earth and passed into merciful unconsciousness. The sheep had been momentarily concerned by the scream and the running, but after the churchyard had gone quiet again, she carried on with her journey to find a nice crop of clover that she remembered was over by the gate. These were the days before lawn-mowers, and a sheep is a fine thing to keep churchyard grass down. The rector of Yarpole was a devout man. Every morning, even before breakfast, he liked to go to his church and pray. That morning he had slept late, so was in a rush. Instead of dressing into full canonicals in the vestry, as was his usual practice, he had hurriedly thrown his white alb over his cassock and headed through the churchyard. Even a devout man will turn pale when he hears moaning coming from an empty grave. But the rector was reasonably brave as well as devout, and, a little gingerly, he moved towards the hole and looked in. There was a small, ill-dressed man looking back up at him. To say the little tailor was suffering would be an understatement. The blow on his head was warring with his hangover, for which was giving him the most pain. Added to that, spending the night contorted in a cold grave had so antagonized his arms and legs that they seemed about to break free from the rest of him. In his pain he looked up at the figure above, the white gown blowing gently in the wind, and uncombed grey hair framing the head like a halo, and he saw an angel, and he knew he was no longer on the earth. "Who are you?" asked the rector, rather more gruffly than he usually spoke to his parishioners. "I used to be the little tailor of Yarpole, but now I suppose I am one of you fellas." "Don't be ridiculous. And please be so good as to get out of that grave. I have a funeral service to conduct here in a couple of hours." It had crept into the tailor's mind that there were probably no hangovers in heaven. His eyes were focusing a little better, and he recognized the rector for the mundane person he was. As quickly as his head and stomach would allow him, he clambered out of the grave and stood before the rector. "So I am still the little Tailor of Yarpole?" "I dare say you are, but now be gone about your business." The tailor and the rector parted. The rector to go about his holy business, and the tailor to rest in his own bed. To say that he went and sinned no more would be something of an exaggeration, but he certainly repented of his wilder ways, and went on to live a long and respected life, glad still to be the Tailor of Yarpole.